Welcome to our daily story. Please give me some feedback. If you've been listening, don't forget to give me a like and leave a comment below. Emily walked into the sun-drenched courtyard, carrying a basket full of white cloths. The morning was peaceful, with only the leaves rustling in the light breeze. Jacob stayed in the office as usual. Emily treasured the peace, but lately it had become heavy, as if the silence brought loneliness, reminding her of the moments she had once shared with other people, but now they seemed like distant memories. She knelt down to put the cloth in the basket, her hands moving instinctively. The sudden strong wind blowing in the yard caught her off guard. The strong wind tugged up the hem of her dress, and Ellen stiffened and shook her face in shame. She quickly grabbed the dress to slide it back into place. When she looked up, Ethan, her stepson, was standing in front of her. He stood a few feet away from her with a dazed expression on his face, though there was something deeper in his eyes, something searching. "Ethan," Emily tried, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you need something?" Ethan hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as if he was waiting his words. "No, I just stepped out for some air," he replied, his voice soft, but there was something unspoken flickering in his eyes, a conflict he seemed reluctant to share. Emily nodded, not knowing what else to say. She returned to the basket and walked toward the house, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were following her. Once inside the house, she stopped at the sink, her thoughts racing. That brief moment seemed to give her strength, though she couldn't explain why. Ethan's calm but sharp gaze seemed to hold unspoken words, stirring something inside her without her realizing it. Emily shook her head, dismissing the thought as absurd. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, but deep down she knew that this moment had left a mark she wouldn't be able to erase. Emily stood in the kitchen, dipping her hands into the warm, soapy water she'd used to wash the dishes after dinner. The trickling of the faucet was the only sound in the house, and that monotony soothed her, allowing her to forget any remaining thoughts of Ethan's eyes. Suddenly she heard soft footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to realize who it was. Taking a plate in her hands, she finished washing her face. Ethan hadn't left. She felt his presence quietly but undeniably, as if the room itself had changed with his appearance. For a moment, the sound of the dripping faucet seemed to grow louder, filling the silence between them. Finally, Emily turned and smiled politely at him. "Why don't you go outside? It's such a nice day." Ethan leaned lightly against the kitchen counter, folding his arms. "I like it better out here. It's quieter here." He looked away for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "Sometimes it feels like the noise outside is drowning me out," he admitted, and there was a vulnerability in his voice, barely above a whisper, that Emily hadn't noticed before. She didn't know how to respond. The way he was looking at her, fixed and focused, made her feel uneasy. She went back to the sink and tried to focus on the task at hand, scrubbing the dishes harder than necessary. "Do you like roses?" asked Ethan, breaking the silence. Emily looked at him, surprised by the question. "Yes, I do," she answered cautiously. Ethan nodded, his lips curving into a small smile. "I've noticed. They look beautiful." His words, though innocent, had a weight she couldn't ignore. Emily nodded, feeling her heart beat faster. "Thank you," she replied. When Ethan walked out of the kitchen, Emily flinched and realized she'd been holding her breath the whole time. Emily was kneeling in the garden, carefully pruning roses. Sunlight streamed through the branches, coating the brightly colored flowers with golden streaks. The beauty around her seemed almost mocking, a reminder of the peace she couldn't find within herself. Each pruning with the secateurs seemed like an attempt to rid herself of her tangled thoughts, but the weight of unspoken emotions remained, as persistent as the scent of roses. Gardening had always been a comfort to her, a way to calm her troubled thoughts, but today her mind had no intention of calming down. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When she looked up, she saw Ethan washing his car not far from her. Droplets of water glistened in the sunlight, sliding across the shiny surface and catching the light like little crystals. Ethan moved very carefully, each gesture purposeful yet relaxed. The sunlight glistened on his tanned skin, and it was hard for Emily not to notice it. She quickly lowered her head, scolding herself. "Focus on the roses," she whispered, clutching the pruning shears. But despite all her determination, her eyes gave her away as she looked at him again. Before she knew it, Ethan stepped closer. "What are you doing?" His voice broke the silence, making her flinch. Emily looked up, her heart racing. "Oh, just pruning the roses," she said in a ragged voice. "They need extra care this time of year." Ethan smiled weakly, his eyes lingering on her a little longer than she expected. "You're doing a great job. The garden looks beautiful." "Thanks," Emily replied, returning to her work and trying to hide her blushing cheeks. Ethan didn't budge. His presence remained looming but unmistakable. "If you ever need help, you know where to find me," he said quietly before walking back to the car. As she watched him walk away, Emily's hand trembled slightly. She tried to focus on the roses again, but his gaze wouldn't let go. The house was quieter than usual when Jacob was away on business. That evening, Emily sat on the living room couch and tried to concentrate on the movie on the television, but the cheerful voices and bright colors on the screen did little to distract her. Her thoughts flitted like a whirlwind between guilt, confusion, and something she didn't dare name. Faint footsteps drew her attention to the door. Ethan appeared, his body softly illuminated by the warm light from the hallway. "Are you still awake?" he asked, his voice quiet and calm. Emily nodded, stroking the corner of his knee with her hand. "I couldn't sleep. How about you?" Ethan entered the room and sat down on the couch across from her, closer than she expected. He leaned back slightly, his gaze hard, as if he was searching her face for an answer she wasn't ready to give. "I've been thinking," he began, and there was a note of indecision in his voice. "Sometimes there are things you know you shouldn't feel, but you feel them anyway." Emily's breath caught for a moment. His words sounded like an echo of her own conflicting emotions that she had tried so hard to suppress. She looked away, trying to realize the dangerous truth in his words. Emily clenched her fingers on the pillow. "What are you saying?" she asked in almost a whisper. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His gaze didn't waver and settled on her with such intensity that her pulse quickened. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said. His words broke the silence like a bolt of lightning. Emily tensed, her mind racing for answers. "Ethan, this isn't right," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know," he replied, his voice soft but unwavering. "But sometimes wrong is the only thing that makes you feel alive." The silence that followed was stifling, filled with unspoken emotions that neither of them could deny.